Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across Australia and the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Hello, Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021 and another season of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we're heading back overseas again today because the Georgia runoffs are happening next week. And I am joined by Democratic strategist Katie Parsons, who was on in November as we got close to the US presidential. Katie comes back on again today we'll do a bit of a debrief on the US elections in November and also do a bit of a preview on the Georgia runoff. So if you want to know all about the election that's going to take place in a few days' time that will determine who will control the Senate in the United States, this is the podcast for you. And don't forget to subscribe to Socially Democratic via your favourite podcast app. Could be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, Stitcher, or whatever one you use. And don't forget to leave us a rating and a review if you listen to it via Apple Podcast. And also for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday, I think. It's that time between Christmas and New Year when I don't know what day it is. And that's a good thing.
It's Tuesday here.
That's going to make it even more complicated. That's right, because it's a completely different time to where you are right now, Katie. I know that it should be day 5 of the Boxing Day test, but it's not because the Australian top order don't know how to bat on what was a very favourable wicket yesterday. Anyway, joining him on the line from the Hoosier State, Indiana, my good friend and Democratic strategist, Katie Parsons. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be back.
This episode will be published on on New Year's Day, so I should say Happy New Year as well, even though it hasn't happened
Yes,
yet.
Finally. Thank goodness.
I know.
Happy New Year.
I just knew as soon as the bells ticked over that, everything would be fixed and COVID wouldn't exist anymore and the world would go back to normal.
Right. That's what I'm banking on.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the last time we spoke, we were getting ready for the presidential election in November, and you and I haven't had a chance to catch up and debrief. So what I want to do today is 2 parts to this episode. Part 1 is to just do a bit of a debrief on the presidential in November, and part 2 is just to do a bit of a preview of the Georgia runoff, which is happening in a week from now on December, I'm getting one bloody months muddled up here, on January the 5th in the States. But before we do that, let's talk about the presidential. First of all, I'm keen to get a sense of how you spent the 4 days from when polling closed to when Joe Biden stood up and accepted the victory of being president-elect. Did you get much sleep over that period of time?
Not the first night. Election night was definitely a lot of anxiety, trying to go to sleep at 2. I did actually go to bed. So I stopped watching the news. And once it was really clear that we weren't going to have an answer, tried to at least close my eyes, but it was like a very angry, angry sleep. But then actually, so I had gotten some tips from friends who were watching the numbers, internal numbers. First, early on, a couple days before Election Day, that things were not looking good in Florida, and that we were probably going to lose there. And I think it was, I was really lucky to have had that, because as that started to unfold on Election Day, I was already prepared for it, and it felt like, okay, things are going to plan. Where I know a lot of people had been following some of the polling that had, huge leads for Biden, and so I think that discrepancy can be really, really stressful if you haven't been able to prepare yourself. So I was a little bit lucky in that sense. And then as as the results started to come in and they were reflecting sort of what the internal numbers were predicting, and those still were lining up and pointing towards a Biden victory. I would say, honestly, by the next day, I was feeling confident in the people who were telling me we're going to win this. Confident enough that I was at least able to eat and sleep.
There's a somewhat benefit for us here in Australia watching the election coverage because it's during the day for us. So as it goes into the early hours in the United States, it's kind of late afternoon for us here in the east coast of Australia, and even earlier for those folks over in WA. But even for us, tragics, we were still like I mentioned this on the episode before, so my guests have heard me say this before, but I literally was mainlining MSNBC for 4 days straight, and I added it up. It was close to 100 hours of TV I watched over 4 days, and I needed to afterwards just stop on everything. Don't read the newspapers. Just give myself a break. I had to detox from US politics. It was intoxicating. That I kind of got to know intimately everyone that was on all of these different networks. Because I saw them, they would appear for like 3 or 4 hours. They'd go have a sleep, and then they'd come. Oh, they're back again. Hello, Anyway, leaving that aside, I mean, it would have been handy to have that information because when Florida, I didn't. My gut told me I didn't think that Biden was going to win Florida, but there was just so much what turned out to be misleading information that suggested that Florida was, a good shot. But in the end, it wasn't even close. Really, it's sort of. He didn't get the kind of turnout needed in sort of Miami-Dade and those parts of the country, and then when the Panhandle stuff came in, it it was a red wave, so to speak.
Yeah.
Where I was freaking out, and I want to get your thoughts on this, was the sort of those Rust Belt states, the states that Biden needed to pick up that Clinton had lost in 2016. All of those on the day votes were obviously favouring Trump. But we were just waiting for these bundles and bundles and bundles of early votes to be counted.
Right.
At what point did you feel comfortable that there was enough of those early votes to overtake Trump and to secure states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan?
Yeah. No, I think the numbers, again, because they were matching up with what was expected, started to feel comfortable. What was that, like Wednesday, Thursday? And really, we're just waiting for those to be called. I mean, there was an abundance of caution by a lot of by the networks, really, because they're the ones who, in a weird way, call it on election day or just after that. And they were really waiting to make sure that there were no surprises in those mail-in ballots, which of course is smart because you never know. But it looked like we were in a good position actually from basically the next day. It was just, let's get those counted and make sure that they actually reflect our expectations. I think Arizona and Nevada, actually, which waited a really long time, and Pennsylvania were the real stragglers there. And it was just sort of like pulling my hair out, waiting for them to call it. But it wasn't so much that I thought we weren't going to win.
Interesting, the networks. Do you think they were a little bit gun shy in calling them this year because of the Trump presidency? Like in previous years, would they have said, for example, in Pennsylvania, there was at one point like close to 1 million early votes in the Philadelphia County alone, and Philadelphia County in the day votes was voting 80% Democrat, and even looking at one or two samples, they were coming in a higher than that in the early votes. So you really could make a prediction, like unless batches substantially had to change the way that they were being counted, that was going to bring Pennsylvania home. And that's kind of what those data guys do, isn't it? They sit in that room without any windows and they just make predictions based on the evidence that they have in front of them. And I felt that the networks were pretty shy because of Trump.
I think that's, well, I would say they were shy. Certainly Trump had put a lot of pressure that was kind of a narrative for months before the election, and they were responding to that. But some of that was also, I think, understandable given how completely different this election was from previous elections because of COVID and all of that early voting. The patterns were, you could make those guesses based on what we know about previous elections, but was this election going to follow that? I don't criticize them for being cautious, I would say, even though, yes, they were.
Yeah.
They were cautious.
Really serious question here. Very difficult for you to answer, I think. So you don't want to get this wrong. Are you a John King CNN guy, or are you a Steve Kornacki MSNBC guy when it comes to your map men?
So I don't have a TV. So I refreshed New York Times a lot constantly.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I watched very little of that coverage, which I think also helped maintain the very level anxiety level that I had, because that stuff, yeah, it definitely makes the heart race. It's funny because I also mainline election results for the UK outside of the US, but I find it really hard to just sit and watch hours and hours of that. It's too personal.
Yeah, well, you just got to have a lot of focus, a lot of determination, it's commitment, and a lot of beer to get you through.
Right.
Now, one thing we did, more seriously, one thing we did talk about in the podcast before Election Day was we wondered what impact the lack of a door-to-door, face-to-face canvassing effort by the DNC would have on the race.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts now? There's a bit of water under the bridge. There's been plenty of hot takes.
Yeah. So the truth, I mean, in a lot of ways, we still don't know. So the data, the detailed data from the elections, right? Who actually voted on election day? That information will be updated by the secretaries of state of each state, basically in February and March. And that's going to be when you start to see different groups who are really digging into the results start to release their data-backed takes on what happened. And so I think there are lots of questions going into that analysis, and certainly for me, the role of door-to-door organizing is a really big one. On the one hand, we can see the outcome regardless, right? Biden won, even with a very small, relatively speaking, door knocking effort. So yes, we were still able to win, even with fewer people on the doors. But then I think, if you start to zoom in on specific states, you look at Arizona, where there are organizations. It's not the candidate campaign, but Mi Familia Vota, Lucha, different organizations who have spent the last 15 years really registering and turning out Latino voters. There's a large Native American population in Arizona who, it just took a lot of effort to register those folks and mobilize them. And I think a lot of that work, a lot of the results that we can see in Arizona is on the back of door-to-door canvassing that was done by those organizations this year and for the 15 years previously. Similarly, and I know we're going to talk about Georgia more, you see Stacey Abrams' organization, lots of other organizations led by Black women who were registering and mobilizing Black voters really more for the last 2 years. And what kind of an impact did that have? I think that's a really big question. I mean, certainly we know that it had an impact. What does that look like when we start to get into the details? I'm very, very curious to see. And then again, we can see the actual outcome. So Biden won, but there are some places where we didn't do as well in congressional races. We didn't do as well in Senate races. There's a lot of suggestion that is because there were fewer people on the doors, and when the national conversation is about Trump, Trump versus Biden, but really about Trump, you didn't necessarily need to have a door-to-door conversation with anybody to break through because it was everywhere, and people didn't need that kind of one-to-one interaction with the campaign. I think we can say that pretty confidently, but for candidates who were down ballot, who maybe have less name recognition, or people just didn't know what they were about. I think there's a real question of what role that played. Now, there are lots of other arguments for why actually it had nothing to do with whether they were talking to people at their door. Was the message right in those races? Were the candidates charismatic or, running a great race? All of those are also very important questions for us to explore. But I am personally very interested to see what happens with what we find out about door to door.
You talked about the congressional races and, a number of Democrats, well, certainly people weren't overjoyed with the results in both the Senate and in the House races. Were you surprised to see a swing back to the Republicans, certainly in the House? I think that kind of took people by surprise. That would be a fair assumption.
Yeah, I think you're right. It certainly is more of a surprise in the House races than in the Senate. Those Senate seats were always, incredible uphill battles for us from the beginning. Yes, things started to look good for us because Trump had been and is still such a disaster on COVID that things were sort of going our way from a messaging standpoint there. But those were always really tough races for us. I think some of the House races, so yes, losing seats in the House in general was somewhat of a surprise given that there had been so much talk of gains. Look at the seats that we lost. A lot of them were seats that had only flipped 2 years before. They're sort of traditional purple seats, in fact, traditional red seats that had only just become purple. And so, yes, it was a surprise because it countered the countervailing narrative for the couple of weeks leading up to election. But if you look at the specific races, it's not so completely surprising.
Polling once again came in for its fair share of criticism. And this year I particularly paid a lot of close attention. In fact, anyone who follows Dunn Street on Instagram would have noticed that in the weeks leading up to it, I published every day the most recent round of state level polling for the presidential and in some cases for crucial Senate races as well. And there's a view there that once again our pollsters failed us and were way off. I just want to get your thoughts on that, and I want to get your thoughts on that first of all, and I'll come up with sort of a follow up because there's another narrative out there that there actually were some pollsters that actually were quite accurate. Rasmussen, for example, which is notionally a Republican poll, is that it's seen as more right wing leaning, I guess is probably the best way I would describe that one. They were bang on with a whole bunch of them. They called Florida for Trump. They called Ohio for Trump. They said that the Midwest was going to be much, much closer. And in the end, that's proved to be right. The Des Moines Register poll was bang on as well. Is it the Seltzer and Seltzer poll? So there were some polls out there that were accurate. But obviously, the big ones like the New York Siena Times poll, all that kind of stuff that had, Biden winning Wisconsin by 60,000 points or whatever. These things did not materialize. So I just want to get your thoughts on, are we being too critical of our friends in data world?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it depends on how you use polls. And I know we talked about this just briefly before, but I guess I don't feel overly critical of pollsters because of the way that I think about using them, which is looking directionally. I don't really necessarily expect to see a 10-point win because that's what a poll shows. I'm really just curious to see, who's up and what is the direction of movement from the last poll. And then more importantly, how are people responding to issues-based questions less than the actual horse race, which I think we know, particularly over the last 4 to 8 years, that is less useful, right? But if you ask people how they feel about whatever the main issue of the day is, that actually gives you a much better indicator of how people are going to vote than who they say that they're going to vote for. So yeah, obviously, there are some places where pollsters really got things wrong, and we need to figure out why that happened and or how we can fix that in the future. Mitch Stewart my boss has shared some hypotheses about, or just looking at where they were accurate. So it's interesting because it's not that the polls were off by the same degree in every state. If you look state to state, there's actually some variation. There's some places where the polls were consistently mostly correct, certainly directionally, and maybe even by margin. And then there are states where they've been way off, on both of those counts. And his take is that we'll still see what happens when we get the updated voter results. If you look at cities or at states that have one or maybe two main really big metropolises with a big suburban ring, and then otherwise, rural populations, but not a massive percentage of the total state, those polls were fairly accurate. Georgia is one of those states, interestingly, going into this. Arizona is another one of those states where Phoenix, is really the anchor. Maricopa County and the suburbs around there really drove the vote, and the polls were pretty accurate there. The states that have a couple of different metropolises, they're more spread out, there's more rural population overall. We clearly haven't figured out how to sample those rural populations. And those are the places where you see the polls consistently off by more. That's just a theory, but
yeah, that's interesting.
It'll be interesting to see.
That's interesting that you said that. What's the challenge that they're facing with sampling rural voters? Like, are they just not picking up the phones? Because we find in Australia, it's our inner cities where we struggle to register a sample of voters, because in the inner city, most people are on mobiles, they're not on landlines. Polling companies don't have a big number of mobile phones to call through, so those sample sizes are small, the pickup rates are small. But as you move further out, you move into the suburbs, the answer rate increases, and then you move into regional Australia, the answer rate goes through the roof. Like, it's like 35-40% that will pick up the phone in the bush, because nothing's going on there, so they'll just answer the phone. I say that as a kid from the country. But in the States, why is the sample size? What is it, a sampling problem in the regions?
I mean, I don't know. That's part of the problem. I would suspect yes. I think, if I just had to take a wild guess, I would say it's probably that, yes, you have those same voters who are hard to reach in the center urban area, but they are voting the same way. And so even if you don't hit some specific breakdown of the population who would be helpful to reach, the other voters you're reaching are voting the same way, and so you're getting sort of the same trend. Or with the rural populations, it's a small sample to begin with. It's hard to reach people. There is, I think, maybe a sense that you don't want to have a political conversation, particularly, that's more likely to be an attitude held in more rural places, and so that maybe they're less willing to have those conversations. I don't know. It's a guess at this point, but it's something we have to really figure out.
Let's turn our attention to Georgia. We have a runoff in Georgia, which is taking place in a week's time, between two Republican incumbent senators and two challenging Democratic candidates. Before we do a breakdown of, just get your thoughts on those candidates, let's explain to those unfamiliar with the concept of a runoff, why are we having a runoff in the state of Georgia weeks after you've just had a massive election?
Yeah, well, this is a real education in every state sets its own election rules in the U.S. And so in Georgia, the rule is you have to get more than 50% of a vote to avoid a runoff. So none of the candidates running in either of the two races broke that 50%, and that's why you're seeing runoffs in January. The reason why there are two seats up, which is actually really unusual in a state, you've got one regularly scheduled Senate election this time around, and then there's also a special election to fill a seat that had been vacated earlier this year. So it's rare to have both, even in Georgia, which is already rare.
And the stakes are very high for this particular runoff because the Democrats currently need 2 more senators to have 50 in the Senate, and with the tying vote being Kamala Harris, the VP, they would then have control of the Senate for the first time in a number of years. So this is critical for the Democrats and for the Republicans, and will really shape the presidency of Joe Biden for the next 4 years. The 2 incumbents, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler. Perdue is the one who's in the. Thank you for giving me the thumbs up on pronouncing her name correctly. Perdue's the one whose election is just. This is just the he's in the cycle, right? It's the other one is the special.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that's right.
What do we know about David Perdue apart from he doesn't like to debate his opposition candidate?
Yeah, he's really wealthy, business owner, and very conservative, but not super right wing. So it's been an interesting race for both he and Kelly Loeffler, who are in normal times probably fairly, they would be fairly moderate Republicans, but they're trying to style themselves as extreme right wingers to make sure that they pull in the excitement around Trump. It's a very strange world that we live in. So that's Perdue. He's running against John Ossoff, who ran for Congress a couple of years ago. He is the CEO of a documentary filmmaking firm, and is 33 years old. He's incredibly young. And is really savvy with digital tactics. So it's really interesting just for any campaign junkies to follow what he's doing digitally. He has worked on other campaigns in the past before he himself became a candidate, and was really known for bringing some interesting and creative digital tactics to those campaigns. So it's been really cool to see what he's doing, particularly to try to turn out youth voters in Georgia. So those are the 2 candidates for the regularly scheduled race. And then you have Kelly Loeffler, as you mentioned, who's the incumbent. She's only been in that seat for, I think, less than a year, maybe just over. She was appointed by the governor to fill Johnny Isaacsen's seat. And so this happens in many states where the sitting governor can appoint a senator if a seat comes up. And so you always, in those cases, you get the party of the sitting governor. And then she is running against Reverend Raphael Warnock, who is a reverend of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which, as is mentioned frequently, is the church that Dr. Martin Luther King was the head of. So that relationship and connection has been really central in this race and very interesting. He's another one I would highly recommend that folks follow his Twitter feed and take a look at the ads that he's putting out, because they're a real masterclass in how to respond to nasty attacks, sort of fake news that's coming his way.
And he has certainly got a bit of that, more so than Ossoff in this campaign. Watching that most recent debate when Loeffler just tried to brand him. Well, I'll let you explain what the Republican strategies are. Right.
So they've definitely hit upon the message strategy, which they used in the general election, have decided that works well for them. And so they're sticking with it, which is, you want to paint all Democrats as radical socialists. Let's, throw the word Marxist around there as much as possible. Talk about defunding the police, which, interestingly, if you poll Americans on the substance of that, which is investing more in social services, education, community service, health, people are very much in favor of that. However, because of some of the just the way that things have unfolded over the summer, the connotations of using that phrase in particular, defund the police, has been a really useful cudgel for Republicans. So, she's trying to paint him as a real radical, and so you will see in his advertising, he's doing everything he can to seem very non-threatening, very, very normal, approachable, as I'm sure he probably really is.
Yeah, I know how you can try and fit up someone being as a radical when you're a person of faith and you have a ministry. I mean, for God's sake, no pun intended, but like really.
Right. Of global standing. Yeah.
And
It's far-fetched.
It is. And even Loeffler was dragging out the Jeremiah Wright stuff that was used against Obama in 2008. And I thought, oh my God, are we that desperate that this is the level? I don't think people even know who Jeremiah Wright is that would be voting in this election. But they're obviously worried because they're stooping to this level in a campaign. And on the flip side, you've got David Perdue, who just won't even turn up for a debate, because when he did debate Ossoff before the election, he got absolutely destroyed. Like that was a masterclass in taking down an opponent who just stood there staring vacantly in the camera, as his whole career was beautifully summed up by Ossoff in terms of the level of corruption and greed that he has overseen whilst being a senator, and conflict of interest and completely ignoring all of that kind of stuff whilst making money off of Americans as Americans die. It was an amazing moment, and obviously Perdue and his team have gone, we're not having that experience again, so you are not going to debate John Ossoff.
Yeah. His line has been that since he was up 2% at the end of the general election, he didn't break 50%, but he was up 2%. His line is he's already won. So he doesn't need to actually debate or join any contest, and that instead they're just going to throw all of their fire against Warnock because he's a bigger threat to Loeffler. I guess it makes sense because, exactly as you said, he is such a disaster against Ossoff that it's a safer strategy than going up against him and trying to portray yourself as a winner. Maybe we'll convince some people that you are, but it's risky.
Okay, so I don't feel overly confident about this election. I'm going to say that in terms of the Democrats. And I want to get your thoughts on this. I don't feel confident because Biden, and look, winning Georgia in the presidential was amazing, like without a doubt. And, you mentioned Stacey Abrams earlier. Just, props to all of those wonderful people that have been doing such great work for such a long time. And then to get that reward in actually winning the state for Biden in November was an amazing effort. But he only won by 11,000 votes.
Right.
Ossoff lost to Perdue in the initial race by 88,000 votes. Clearly, I shouldn't say clearly, it appears that voters were voting strategically with their ballots, in that they were voting against Trump, but then they were voting for the Republican in the Senate. How do you feel going into this race for these two particular Democratic candidates?
Yeah, I think the smart money in general, if you were a person who's betting and you want to make a smart bet or a safe bet, is that we won't take the Senate. So, I mean, probably the smart money is that we don't take either seat, but maybe we take one. I think the idea that we win both, it's not impossible, but it's definitely a long shot. These are two very, very difficult races for us to win. And so, that also means these are the Republicans' races to lose. And they kind of seem hell-bent on losing them. Every move that they're making at a national level, because these are essentially playing out as national level elections in practically every way, are cutting to our advantage, at least so far. But I think that you're not wrong to think that they're really difficult races for us to win. Even if every single person who voted last time around or in November voted this time, that would be hard enough. Of course, that actually isn't going to be what happens. There has always been a drop off from the general to a runoff. We're seeing huge early turnout numbers. I checked the numbers before we talked just so that I would have them, and it's 2.3 million have voted early as of today. That's an astonishing number. 5 million total voted in the general. So those are really record-breaking numbers. But it still doesn't mean that we're gonna break the total number who voted in the general. And as we saw last time around, the people who vote early and the people who vote on election day are often completely different demographics. And so even if things look good for us in who is voting early, and it does, it doesn't mean that the Republicans won't make that up on election day.
If you were to construct an argument as to why the Democrats could possibly pinch one, if not two, of these runoffs, what arguments would you look to? For example, can I start with one?
Please.
Donald Trump's not on the ballot.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in many ways, he's putting himself on the ballot in a really aggressive way that's got to be driving those candidates crazy. I mean, in some ways, I actually think, like as you're implying here, Trump is a major driver of Republican voters in a huge way. He's also, some of his particularly loony advisors are suggesting that voters not vote in this election, that Republicans not vote in this election in order to help make the case that it was rigged against Trump. That, I can't imagine that you're going to see a massive drop off in votes in direct response to that, but the margins are really tight. So who knows, that could be enough to impact the outcome. So that's coming from a connection to Trump. He's also driving a wedge between the party in his efforts to, as your listeners may or may not have been following. So the stimulus bill has already passed, trying to pass an additional increase in direct checks that will go to voters who make, I think it's under $75,000 a year. Trump suggested it shouldn't be just $600, it should go up to $2,000. Now, this is something the Democrats are wildly in support of. We love this idea. Give it to us. We're absolutely in favor of that. That is completely antithetical to the Republican position, who, we had to beg and claw our way to $600 to get that. So he is now setting this up as a litmus test in a way. Do you stand with him and support the $2,000 checks going to voters, which voters desperately want? Or do you go against him and stand with, sort of traditional Republican values that you are going to be held account to, in a couple of months and certainly in a couple of years, either way. So you're seeing for several days, the candidates Perdue and Loeffler wouldn't comment on their position on whether there should be $2,000 checks. I think just in the last day, you've seen at least implications that they support that. But now there's a real push to actually make sure that there's a vote in the Senate, which Perdue and Loeffler, since they are sitting senators, would be forced to really take a stand one way or the other on this. And hopefully we'll be able to push them to make that vote, because it's I think can only help us whichever way it goes, actually. So these are all Trump effects. It's not the same as him being on the ballot, but he is throwing his weight around. And I think it's, for him, important to make sure that people see that he's throwing his weight around and can influence those things. So those are some ways that Trump is influencing this, I think, potentially, hopefully in favor of Democrats. Another is, again, those organizations who were doing the long, hard work to register and turn out voters in Georgia. You've seen a renewed investment in registering voters. People who turned 18 between the general election and this runoff election could register to vote. And that's such a short amount of time. But they were, organizations and candidates on the ground were really prepared and ready to go immediately to start registering that cohort of voters. You've seen, even just in the early vote numbers, something like, I think it's 80,000 new voters. So people who did not vote in the general election have voted in early in this runoff. Now, we don't know who those people are. That's not to suggest that those are all those newly registered voters. But that's a weird number, right? If anything, you expect those people, those new voters, to be less likely to vote in a off cycle, middle of January or December election. So those are promising numbers. The other thing that's promising is seeing the increase in youth turnout and engagement. Those numbers break heavily for Democrats traditionally, and I think we can expect that to stand up, something on like a 65-35 split. All of those things are really promising for us. I still wouldn't put money on us winning, but it's not impossible.
The other thing that you sort of touched on slightly was the divisions within the Republican Party right now. I haven't seen much written about it in most recent days, but certainly in that period when Trump wouldn't, well, he still hasn't actually conceded, but when he was really, he was really ramping up the argument about ballot fraud and this is an illegitimate victory and all that kind of stuff. That there was a division within the Republican Party, particularly in Georgia, who was saying, "All right, we need to get back to this is insane." But there was other aspects, particularly. I felt that Perdue and Loeffler were being wedged on it in some way because they are so heavily reliant on Trump's base to turn out for them to get re-elected. But at the same time, was also recognizing that there's the establishment of the Republican Party in Georgia was sort of going, we need to get back to sort of reality and normalcy here and stop undermining our democracy. Those divisions must not help when you're heading into a critical election campaign such as this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can chalk that up to another Trump effect, right? Of him making things difficult for his own party. That's exactly right.
Where on election day in November, my man Steve Kornacki was really focusing heavily on those counties in and around Atlanta.
Yeah.
And that had moved heavily towards the Democrats from the previous election. Right. Counties like Gwinnett and Cobb and Fulton and DeKalb, these names that became household names for all of us over the course of those 4 days watching the count. We're all experts about the suburbs of Atlanta now. This area is going to once again be critical for Ossoff and for Warnock on Tuesday next week.
Yeah, I think that's right. It will be really interesting to see if those collar counties with suburban voters continue their trend towards voting for Democrats. There's certainly I have a question of how many of those voters were simply sick of Trump, and how many of them are really behind Democrats for elections to come. And so this will be an interesting indicator of that. Yeah, I would definitely look to see what's the turnout like, what's the how do the votes split around Atlanta, and then looking also in some of the northern counties that are quite rural in Georgia. We've seen a real drop off in turnout. So these are traditionally Republican counties. Early vote turnout is lower even than it was during the general at the same period of time. So you're seeing less enthusiasm there. It is no accident then that Trump is holding his rally there on the day before the election in Georgia, really hoping to amp up enthusiasm in those rural counties. That will be the other thing to watch, is what is the turnout like in those places? Have they decided to stay home, or are they flying to support the Republicans?
Well, we shall find out in a few days' time. Last question before we wrap up is actually about Donald Trump. How do you see the final days of his presidency playing out?
Honestly, I try really hard not to think about it. I think he will continue to do what he's been doing so far, which is sort of going back and forth between retreating and trying to avoid the public eye and discussion of his loss and how embarrassing that must be for him. And then deciding, wait a second, you guys can't forget about me, and lobbing bombs, right? And of course, he's not really directing them in any particular direction. He's hurting his own party as much as ours. So I think you'll probably see similar things, right? He likes the attention, I think, more than any particular outcome. And so I think you'll see him continue to try to grab that attention. What do things look like on Inauguration Day? I don't know.
Yeah.
There are people who've spent a lot of time gaming out what are the different scenarios, that we could see, and how do we make sure that he's actually out of the White House when it's time for for Biden to take over. And I'm confident that the people who've spent a lot of time thinking about it have that well under control.
I envisage this the presidential security knocking on the toilet door in the White House on Inauguration Day. Mr. President, you really need to leave now. The Bidens are literally in the car out the front waiting. This is going to be awkward. I actually don't think he's going to go. Is he currently down at Mar-a-Lago? Like, I just feel like he doesn't return back to Washington.
He has said that he will be back in Washington on the 6th when Congress certifies the vote. But you're right. He's been spending a lot of time in Mar-a-Lago.
Well, I'm sure there'll be some crazy twists and turns in this final chapter of Donald Trump's presidency. So we will all watch with bated breath. Katie Parsons, thank you so much for taking time out of your holidays to come on the show and talk to us about just US politics in general, and obviously getting us ready for the Georgia runoffs for next week.
My pleasure. It's always fun.
We'll talk to you soon.